Once you were old enough, what were the dark family secrets you were finally let in on? My father was married with another woman before meeting my mother. They had a daughter and my dad loved her so much his wife started going crazy jealous. My dad noticed some strange behavior she had towards the girl, and when he tried to talk to her about it she started arguing with him. He then left with his daughter to my uncle's house. She knew my dad would leave the girl with my aunt while he was at work, so she called the police and said my aunt kidnapped her child. The police came in and took the girl away from my aunt. She immediately tried to call my dad. But the woman drove back home, put poison in her daughter's milk and forced her to drink it. When my dad arrived, he found his daughter already dead and left alone. The woman was never ever found. My dad had never had justice for his first child. Kinda sad. Then when I was born my mother didn't mind to name me after my sister. We share the same name, and that's actually how I found it out. I asked my parents about my name and they told me the whole story. When I was around 3 to 4, my aunt and her 3 sons came and lived with us for a few weeks. One night my mom stayed up and I found her downstairs sitting in a chair looking out the window. One day, my aunt and the boys moved and never came back. Turns out, she was going through a nasty divorce. She had the boys at the house with her while she was packing things one day, and her husband came home. He locked the boys in a room, stabbed her, and then shot himself. My mom had been staying up with a gun that night because she had seen him in our backyard earlier that night. I was told that my mother's older brother had died in an accident. He was intoxicated and got run over by a train, a whole bunch of unfortunate circumstances, etc. My grandmother often mentioned it with sadness, because she considered him a brilliant boy, very handy and had a hopeful career in arts. He was a teenager when he died. However, every time this story came up, my mother's face hardened and she never spoke about it herself. I could kinda sense that there was something left unsaid, but I was a kid, so I didn't really question the story. My mom finally confided in me about a year ago that she was sexually abused by her brother and that it was not an accident, but a suicide. My grandmother has no idea. My paternal grandfather was an alcoholic wife abuser who regularly cheated on grandma. When my father was a teenager he stood up to him, and threatened to kill him if he ever touched her again. The abuse stopped. Grandpa died while snorting coke and getting head in his Corvette. Got a Facebook message from one guy asking if I was related to my dad, since it's not a common last name. I thought he was a fan of his work, because I was in college at the time and the guy was about the same age as me. And that's how I found out my dad slept around and that I had a half-brother the same age as me. My mild-mannered Christian mother casually told me that she dated a gangster who trafficked cocaine in New York during the 80s. He bought her a brand new BMW before getting sentenced to prison for murder for 20+ years. Someone who was friends with her and her ex for years turned out to be an FBI informant and she barely escaped jail, had to enter a witness protection program and moved cross-country. Here's the craziest part, he's still stalking her, has contacted her on her birthday every year for 40 years, and keeps tabs on her. My dad has no idea. I asked her why she waited so long to tell me. Like, what if she went missing? And she said, oh, honey. He's the type of person that if he wanted to harm me, I would already be dead by now. Very comforting. Cousin of mine's dad blew his own head off in the horse stall next to him while they were cleaning them. I was told about that at around 15 because I was going to spend some time with them, and was told not to mention their father. My grandfather killed his youngest brother to get out of going to Vietnam. He, his brother, and 2 of their friends had their numbers called in the draft for Vietnam. They didn't want to go, obviously, but they didn't come from money and all worked to support their families. If they got arrested they'd lose their jobs and their families would lose their income. So they decided on a different plan to get out of going. They would drive to get their medical checks together, and on the way there they would drive the car into a tree. The plan was to get too injured to get sent to war, but not so injured as to be permanently crippled, and it had to look like an accident so nobody got arrested. This was in country Western Australia, so they were all going to say they swerved to miss a kangaroo, and hit the tree. My grandfather was driving, his friend was in the passenger seat, and the other 2 were in the back. His brother was behind the passenger seat. They hit the tree doing about 40 km/h, enough to be serious. A broken leg for my grandfather, a broken arm for the guy behind him, and broken ribs all around. They definitely weren't going to war. The problem was that for maximum impact, and because this was rural Australia in the 60s, they weren't wearing seat belts. And nobody found them or their car for an hour or so. And nobody considered internal injuries in this plan. And my grandfather's brother bled to death from a ruptured spleen in the back seat. He was dead before they got to a hospital. My grandfather never forgave himself, and he never talked about it. My grandma was the only one he ever told, as far as we know, and she didn't tell my mother and I until long after his death. We found a small box in their bedroom when we were cleaning out the house after she died last year. It had a clipping from the local newspaper at the time about the accident. It said that they had swerved to miss a roo, and called it a tragedy. I don't think my mother told any of her siblings, so technically this is still the family secret. I guess now you're all in on it. My father met my mother in the Philippines when he was stationed there in the Navy. He married her there and conceived me. He went away to finish his tour of duty. My mother moved to America when she was a month away from giving birth to me. She moved in with relatives in Texas. My father's tour ended while he was in Hawaii. He met a woman there and called my mom in America, asking for a divorce. He wanted to take back his recent marriage to her, with a kid on the way, because he had a hot one-night stand. My mother was already scared, being in a new country, not knowing much English. Add to this that she was pregnant, about to give birth, and her husband was dumping her. My Texan uncle got on a plane to Hawaii, prepared to kick my father's butt. He somehow talked my father into being a man and taking responsibility for his wife and child. The fact that the fling dumped him surely helped. He was back by the time I was born. I learned all this when I was 11, around the time my parents got divorced. It was only the first of countless dark family secrets I would come to learn during my teenage years. Not very much a secret, but took me until I was older to understand what was happening. My mom would sometimes have us play a game called Army, which consisted of me, my mom, and my siblings army crawling around our apartment. Kind of a hide-and-seek style game. She would yell hit the deck, randomly, and we would all drop and find a hiding spot. We would giggle and giggle while my mom army crawled around looking for us. We loved the game so much. I realized a few years ago while retelling the story that we lived in a really terrible neighborhood, and she would yell it out when she heard gunshots outside the building. I'm assuming she was worried about stray bullets. My grandmother tried to murder my grandfather when she got sick of him beating the crap out of her every day. She swung an axe at him and he blocked it with his hand and lost his thumb. She left him before I was born. Mine is more cool than horrifying on the sense I'm proud of this one. My grandfather was an amazing guy. He was a sniper paratrooper in World War II. Always refused to talk about the army. I learned later that he was dishonorably discharged after injury. Turns out the sergeant in his squad was an absolute jerk. He had to go behind enemy lines to set a post up, and the plane was flying too low for a safe jump. He protested it to the sergeant, who proceeded to shove him out of the plane after calling him a coward. Both my grandfather and his spotter partner were seriously injured in the landing. His partner, never knew him, was paralyzed and lost a leg. My grandfather broke both of his arm, hand, and some ribs. They both were rescued shortly after and taken to a military hospital. That's not what got him discharged, though. Turns out the sergeant showed up to visit them in the infirmary, and my grandfather punched him square in the face with his only good hand, twice. If his only army buddy we ever knew is to be believed, he was also visiting at the time, he floored the guy. After that, and on top of his injuries, the army sent him home for the rest of the war. We found out later after he passed, and we had to go through his stuff, a bunch of newspaper and article clippings about the folks involved he had kept. The sergeant was also discharged after a similar incident cost the lives of 2 other members of his squad a year later that weren't so lucky. The man apparently drunk himself to death years later. We found all these written but unsent letters to his sergeant. We found photos of my grandfather's squad and the 2 that died with him. It was heartbreaking. I never knew any of this. He was such a fun, kind, and goofy guy, you'd never think anything like this would happen to him. Now I knew why my parents always said never to bring my up the army around him. Miss you, Grandpa. I'd have punched the guy too. Grandma had 13 siblings, of those 7 women are still alive. Once a year they have a sister day where they all except one are going somewhere to have fun. They've been doing this since they were teens. All but one sister, who has been lied to her whole life about Sister Day, because she thinks it doesn't exist. This is supposed to have been started when that one sister borrowed something and didn't give it back. Or something trivial like that. We are all reminded whenever we all get together, pre-pandemic, that we're not to talk about this, because it will hurt that sister. Still can't wrap my head around how backstabbing some family members of mine are. Because this is just stupid. My father always tells me as a joke that it's my fault my mom and him are married, I'm the second son. But through the years from drunk conversations and several sources I pieced the story together. My parents separated before they knew my mother was pregnant and only came back together after I was born. When I was young I thought it was really nice that my nana lived with my aunt and her family since she was getting on a bit and it meant she was looked after and there were always people around. Aunt has 6 kids. Occasionally aunt would gripe about being the one looking after nana since aunt is also one of many kids and being young I sympathized, but given they all spent loads of time with nana too didn't think it was a big deal. You don't think about financial responsibility when you're young I think, just social and caring. Well, it turns out the reason nana lives with aunt is because aunt and her husband convinced nana to put the house in their name so they could look after her affairs and sold it out from under her, and invested the money in a pyramid scheme, so it's gone now. Because of this her siblings refuse to give aunt a penny towards looking after nana since it's her fault nana has no money or assets and instead pay to take nana out all the time, meals, shopping, activities, so she doesn't go without, but they let aunt struggle under the weight of nana's general living expenses. Aunt's kids are all independent now so they are not going to be impacted by money problems. Now I look back at her griping with annoyance and think what a terrible person she is. Not so much let in on, as we found out by accident, but apparently my dad's first love and him got into a serious car crash when he was 25 and she died. He lived with her father for years after her death. He still occasionally comes to visit my dad, even 30 years later. We were always told he was a mentor until my sister pressed my mom on the subject. One of my sisters is even named after the girl that died, middle name, and we never even knew about her until last year. None of us have ever brought it up with him. My grandma retired and she still decided to work for her brother in his restaurant to save up money for when she dies. Funerals are, obviously, expensive. She insisted he would hold on to her paychecks and pay for her funeral when she dies. He never did.